Today we're going to try out two different watercolor techniques. The first one is called wet on dry. The second one is called wet on wet. These are two different methods for making watercolor paintings. So for today's assignment, you're going to draw two shapes. They can be the same shape. I have made a square and another square. Your goal today is going to be to fill in your shape with a color and then to add some patterns on top. But the two different ways we're going to do this are wet on dry and wet on wet. In the following clip, I'm going to show you the difference between the two. This video is all about the two yellow cups. You can see that on the left, the yellow cup that I painted is already starting to dry. And the one I'm currently painting, I'm working on, and the paint is obviously still wet because I'm still working on it. Depending on what type of paper you're using, your paint might dry really quickly or it might dry a little more slowly. So experiment with different types of paper if you'd like before you find one that you like better. Now, my goal with these yellow cups is that I'd like to put some designs on them. You might have an image in one of your watercolor paintings that has some designs on it. Maybe you're painting a person and you want to fill in their skin tone, and then you want to be able to put a face over the top or something like that. Using a wash like this, where you fill in the entire shape with one color, you can then go over the top with a design as long as you use a color that will go over your base color. I chose yellow here because pretty much all colors can go over yellow. Now it's still wet, so you'll notice that some interesting things happen once I try to put some designs over the top. I'm going to use blue. Watch what happens to my designs with wet paint on wet paint. The blue is not staying in one place. You have probably already noticed that the blue is running and mixing with the yellow and moving a lot. This is a cool effect. You might really like the way it looks. But if you're trying to make a painting of something that's supposed to have a nice crisp design, and this is what ends up happening, this is a really good way to actually ruin your painting. So now you can see what the yellow cup on the right looks like when I have wet yellow paint and I put wet blue paint over the top. The yellow cup on the left is now dry. And so now I want to show you what happens when I put wet blue paint over dry yellow paint. On the other cup, you noticed right away that the blue started to blend and smear into the yellow, and it didn't stay in one place very well. You can see right away here that the blue stays exactly where I put it, because the yellow paint was dry. So this is an example called wet on dry, where I'm putting wet blue paint over dry yellow paint. You can get a nice crisp design this way. So if you want to add designs on top of something that is a color, and you want those designs to be nice and crisp and clear, you should use a wet on dry technique. If you want your colors to blend and smush together, then you should try out the wet on wet technique. There you can see two very different techniques. Wet on dry on the left and wet on wet on the right. Now it's your turn to try out these techniques. So in your first shape, you're going to paint it a color. It really doesn't matter what color. I will say that it's a little bit easier to see these things if you paint them onto a lighter color like orange or yellow, but it is totally up to you. This first shape we're going to let dry, and we're going to paint a design over the top of it after it's dry. And then the one on the other side, you're going to paint the wet paint in here and put a design over the top while it's still wet. You can make whatever design you want. As soon as I'm done with my wet on wet, I'm going to start putting designs on top. Because the whole point is that the first color is still wet. And then watch what happens to the designs that you put over the top. Now that my square on the left is dry, I can paint some blue over the top. And you can see a difference between wet on wet and wet on dry.